we're going to be talking about motivation, internal motivation and external motivation. So, what is motivating me to make this video? Well, I think, a lot of conversations I've been having with people, there's this underlying question of motivation that is coming up. And motivation I see as being connected to things like people-pleasing, things like not really having a sense of identity, a sense of self, connected to sort of like not knowing what you want in life, not having a sense of purpose is connected to motivation. So let's talk about motivation. Let's talk about what that is. Let's talk about how people get into, those struggling with those sorts of things. So first, what is motivation? Motivation is essentially just your drive or your desire to do things. It's been written about extensively in psychoanalytic theory using terms like libido and desire. And in that context, it's been very connected with sex and sexuality. Now, I don't think it's incorrect to associate sex with these things, but I do think it's very limited. I think there's a lot more to do with desire than just sexual desire. So I think this really, and they expand, the psychoanalytic theorists, they expand and they talk about all of our desires and how they impact on the lives we lead and the societies we have. I think, and so to be specific, Freud wrote in Civilization and Its Discontents that essentially because we all have repressed sexual desires, that's what's leading to violence in our societies. Or maybe he was saying that there's too much unrepressed sexual desire and that actually we need to repress it some more. One of those things. But Freud had a pretty pessimistic idea about human nature. And a lot of that was connected to, he thought we just had these desires, these uncontrolled urges that we couldn't control, and that led us to be pretty horrible to each other. And I would say, well, that's probably connected to us not being in connection with our desires. So maybe this is going to be a transition point to talk about external motivation, in which we are being motivated by external forces, external factors, rather than our own internal thoughts, desires, motivations. So I think it's very common for a lot of us to be in this sort of external motivation space because it is what our society creates for us through authority figures, through growing up as a young person and not having a lot of agency, not having a lot of autonomy in our own lives. And so examples. In the family, parents have absolute authority over their children, and usually their desires are much more important than their children's desires, and the young people are not taught to get in touch with what they themselves desire. It's much more important, what does the parent desire? Similarly, in schools, it's the same thing with teachers. We're given assignments with clear, or sometimes not clear, rubrics. We have to fulfill the things they want to do. And there are other styles of teaching, or what's called pedagogy, that are much more about our desires, our internal desires, what we want to learn about. But that's not the mainstream public education system or private education system. And, also things like religion. Religion will tell us how to live our lives, and I think that can be really helpful for a lot of people, but also in terms of when religion is harmful, when it says certain people shouldn't have rights, then when we're using that as our source of external motivation, that can cause a lot of harm. Similarly, I think also in sports, coaches are telling people what they should or shouldn't do rather than those people making those decisions for themselves. And in particular when people are very young. So I think growing up, there are so many various adults, various forces that teach young people to to react to what their desires are, and this is how we end up in this cycle of our desires are connected to what someone else wants. And it teaches us long term to ignore what our bodies are telling us, what we want. So in the end, we become very reactionary. We react to what we believe someone else is telling us, what they want. And then this also can lead to reactionary politics, in the sense that, you just react to something that's happening, it makes you feel bad, have a reaction. And this is like where some very authoritarian and politics and like psychoanalytic theorists have talked about this, and I'm specifically referencing Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, in which they talk about how, those who have reactionary repressed desires, that they desire control over other people who they view as having more free desires, or more able to connect with the things that they want, as they view it as disgusting, gross, wrong. And you see the same sort of things in moral panics today around queer people and people living in a way that is not, the way that these very reactionary conservative people would themselves live, as they view it as wrong to have these desires. And I think also left-wing people can have very reactionary desires too, in the sense that they're responding to like certain bad things that are happening and just reacting and pushing against them, rather than to say like, this is what I want. These are the changes I want to see. So, brief aside into political realm. I think also now we'll talk about internal motivation. So internal motivation is our own desires that we have that are coming up from within us, or within relationships that we're in, that we're noticing what our desires are. And this is a learned skill. This is something that we have to learn in a context where we feel safe enough to connect with our own desires, and where we feel safe enough to express those desires, and in which those desires are responded to, and in which we actually can get those things that we're desiring, or those experiences, or those connections that we're desiring. And the issue with this is that really we're taught not to connect with our internal desires, and so as a result, many of us don't know what we desire, don't know who we are, or where we feel comfortable. So this can be a real sticking point. It's like, how do I connect with this? I have no idea what that even is supposed to look like. Well, you're gonna have to teach yourself, and not just teach. I take that back. You're not just teaching yourself, but also within the context of a safe relationship. And but I think part of it can start with yourself. And it does maybe need to be a bit of a long process of connecting with certain smaller desires before you start to express your desires more and more, as you feel more comfortable, as you maybe are, letting go of harmful things that are causing you to distance yourself from your desires. So I like to think of this as not just internal motivation, but also as responsive desire, responsive motivation, responsive politics. Meaning, in contrast to reactionary desire, which is just like this knee-jerk reaction to something, responsive desire is to receive stuff that's happening, to notice, okay, I'm noticing this on the outside, I'm noticing this on the inside, and now I'm choosing how I want to respond, and I'm choosing what are my desires in this situation. So I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a fire, you're camping with your friends, there's a fire, and you accidentally, your hand got itself into that fire. Your reactionary desire is to pull your hand away. That's what I mean by reactionary desire. It's just this quick, automatic response. Whereas responsive desire might be, okay, we set up a fire. We wanted to set up a fire because it's getting cold. We noticed it's getting cold. We decided to set up a fire. We set up the fire. Now that we have a fire, we can do things like roast marshmallows and make s'mores. Or we can do things like just sit and bask in the warmth of the fire. We can do things like putting more kindling into the fire, or we can say, it's time for bed. Let's let the fire peter out. So this is an example of what I mean, because you're paying attention to your environment and you're saying, in response to everything that I'm noticing, this is my desire and I'm going to do things to meet this desire. Whereas a reactionary desire is quick, like something's wrong, we're reacting to it. So in terms of now connecting with responsive motivation, how do we do that? What I would say is start small. Start small with everyday things you can do where you don't need anyone else's input. So things like, what do you want to have for dinner? You get to pick that. Theoretically, I know some people have situations where maybe you're in a living situation where this isn't just your decision, right? You're sharing that decision with other people, or maybe someone else is making that call for you. But I think actually a big part of this is having space to connect with your responsive motivation, your responsive desire. And part of that is not being in an authoritarian environment. So if you are, finding out how can you leave. But also, even within that environment, finding little ways of discovering how can you respond to your desire. But yeah, I think another example of that would be like, why do you want to do particular things? And like, what was the thing that precipitated your wanting this? So for instance, you have a long day of work, you come home, you want to drink, you end up having quite a few drinks, and you feel bad the next day. So getting curious about, why did I want that drink? Oh, it's because I didn't sleep well, it's because I didn't eat well, it's because I got this bad stuff from my boss, customers were rude to me. And then also curious about, why did I continue? Like, why didn't I just have the one, but why did I have as many as whatever? So I think building a responsive motivation, building a responsive desire, a big part of that is being curious about, what are you wanting and why are you wanting it? And then also, how do you feel after getting that thing? Do you feel restored or do you feel empty, and why? Maybe once you're out of an authoritarian environment, maybe once you are connecting more with your responsive desire, your responsive motivation in little ways, thinking about what are your bigger, longer term sorts of desires. So things like, who do you want to have in your life? And what types of relationships do you want to have with those people? What does community look like for you? And what do you want your life to look like? What is a life you want to lead? And what are those things you can do to set that up long term? Who are you, right? It's like a big one, and that's connected to getting in touch with these desires about the connections you want to build and the life you want to live and the things you want to be doing day to day. And then in connection to that, what life do you want to live? Also, what do you want the world to look like? Because this is something you're allowed to have an opinion about, don't you know? Is what are your desires for things to change, things to look different? And then also something you could say is, how do you reach towards achieving those things? Or we can't change everything, right? But this is where getting into like, hey, I really want the world to be different in this way, and I'm going to connect with other people who also have that desire. Because once you know what your desires are, you can connect with other people who share those desires. And that's really sort of where I want to put an exclamation point here, is connecting with others who share your desires. Once you start connecting with what your desires are internally, And at that point, there's a synchronicity, or like a connection between the internally, what are you desiring, and externally, what are you hearing from others. And also that they're respecting if there are differences, these people. So to conclude, I really think connecting with what motivation is about connecting with internally what is driving you, and that also being responsive to your environment. So being responsive to the world you're in, but given certain conditions that are in the world, how do you want to respond? How do you want things to look in response to that? Making those decisions and thinking about them and identifying, how do you want to define yourself in this context? What is important to you? And then, how can you build a meaningful life? Because you can, once you're connecting with your responsive desires. I'm going to leave you with that. Why don't you share in the comments, what are some things that are responsive desires that you currently hold? Like, what do you desire that is a part of something you're noticing in your environment that you're responding to, but that is your desire that you're choosing for yourself? Why don't you share that in the comments? And if you like this video, if you'd like to see more, I'd appreciate it if you could like the video, subscribe to the channel. There's also a Patreon link in the description if you would like to support me so I can keep making videos. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.